And that's what's happening today at 5:30 p.m. We are going to be live with those oral arguments. It's going to be remote. It's going to be over Zoom, but it's going to be fascinating to hear the prosecution, the defense. The question is, what's going to happen to Scott Peterson? It's a lot to break down, and I want to bring in my guests. I have a great guest today, but what a lineup to start off the show. First up, the founder of Law and Crime, Dan Abrams. Also, Peterson's former attorney, Lara Yeretsian. It's great to have both of you here. And Dan, I want to start with you because the big issue, or one of the big issues in this appeal, is that there was so much pretrial publicity, the defense said this case should have been moved to another jurisdiction. You covered this case. Let's go back to 2003, 2004. What was it like, Dan, this trial? I mean, why was there so much attention around this case?
So there's no question there was an enormous amount of attention surrounding this case. But the notion that somehow it would have been better outside of Modesto, I don't know that that's such a persuasive argument. This case got so much national attention. Yes. Did the Modesto Bee, the local paper there, cover it every day, cover it more than, let's say, the LA Times? Of course it did. This is the sort of argument that many defendants in high-profile cases make when a change of venue is denied, is I should have been able to get this case tried somewhere else. And since it wasn't, I should get a new trial. It's not his strongest argument. He doesn't have a lot of strong arguments, but I don't even think it's one of his stronger arguments. But it is certainly one of the two big ones that appears to be focused on today. I think the bigger arguments are going to be with regard to the jury. I think his only hope here is about how the jury was selected, who ended up making it onto the jury. Those are the sorts of questions that this court is going to evaluate. Peterson does not have a winning argument, I don't think, but it's a real argument, and one I think that the court will at least take seriously.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting ones, really, the idea that jurors were excused because they wrote on their questionnaires that they don't really are in favor of the death penalty, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't have voted in favor of the death penalty if the facts persuaded them otherwise. We're going to get into that argument, but Lara, I want to go to you. The big thing here from the defense is there was a fundamental unfairness for Scott Peterson. You were on the team. You were on that team. Was there an unfair trial? Did Scott Peterson not get what he needed in this judicial system? Did he not get a fair jury? Did he not get a fair judge? I mean, that's really what we're looking at in this appeal.
Clearly, you must know what the defense answer is to that. Of course, he didn't get a fair jury. Of course, he didn't get any type of fairness. The pervasiveness of the coverage of the case. I mean, Scott was basically convicted before he stepped foot into the courtroom. He was convicted even before he was arrested, unfortunately. I mean, there was a media frenzy. There was so much interest in the case. And I'm sure there's many reasons, many ways to explain why there was such an interest in the case and why everybody was just fascinated by it. I mean, everybody was glued to any coverage related to the case. So clearly my position hasn't changed. As part of the original defense team, I was very involved at the preliminary hearing stage, not as involved during the trial, since I was in LA, and once in a while I would go up and help out, and I would help them from here. But the result itself tells me a lot. It speaks volumes. Had the jury been really paying attention to what the defense was presenting during the trial, and had they kept an open mind, which is what any impartial jury is supposed to do, right? Keep an open mind. They would not have convicted Scott. This was not a case where he should have been convicted. There was no forensic evidence whatsoever.
There are some people who would disagree with you, Lara, and I'll tell you, the evidence here has divided people since this case happened. And Dan, you had an interesting exchange once with Mark Garagos, who was Peterson's attorney, and this was interesting because, again, when we talk about the evidence dividing people, here's a clear example of it. Let's take a look.
When he took his shower, he's all worried about her.
Do you want to talk about the fact that he was out there searching the neighborhood immediately?
This is now you understand what you're up against when you're trying a case like this. It's a media gangbang.
Yeah, the evidence is hard. I know it's tough. It's tough. The evidence is so hard, Mark. I get it. I'm going to lay it out for you. I'll lay it out for you. You asked what it was. I'm going to lay it out for you. Okay, I know. Okay, you want to listen? Do you want to listen?
Dan,
shut up for a second. Just shut up.
Shut up.
Okay, here we go. Here's the evidence. Here's the evidence, all right? December.
Dan, first got to say, love that clip for so many different reasons. But really, the question is this appeal is very procedural. Let's say he gets a new trial, okay? Let's say he gets a new trial. Yeah. Based upon everything you've seen, can he really get a not guilty verdict? I mean, could it change?
Yeah, I mean, this really wasn't that close a case. The best sort of PR argument they have is that the evidence was circumstantial, and it was, right? I mean, the only sort of piece of physical evidence about Laci's hair was very much disputed. So this is definitely a circumstantial case. But when the circumstantial case comes down to two basic facts, one of which are Peterson's own words, right? He's on tape talking about a lot of things that don't help his case at all, talking to his girlfriend in the past tense, talking about the fact that his wife had died. There's always this argument that the defense always made was the idea that, oh, just because he had an extramarital affair. No. It wasn't about the extramarital affair. It's about what he said to the woman with whom he had the extramarital affair. And then there's the other really sort of difficult fact for the defense to deal with, which is Scott Peterson was fishing 90 miles away from his house. He had to identify that that's where he went fishing because there was documentation that that's where he'd gone. Lo and behold, the bodies are found right in the bay where he was fishing that day. That is awful luck. I know. The defense's perspective is, I don't know, either some devil worshippers potentially put it into the bay there, or someone did it to frame Scott Peterson 4 months, whatever the amount of months it was after the incident. Suddenly the bodies come up that they waited months and months and months to frame Scott Peterson by putting the bodies there. Those two, without getting even into all the details about other evidence here about timing and dog tracking and what he said to other witnesses, those two overriding things will convince any jury, again, no matter where it is, that Scott Peterson is guilty. Now, let me say this. His family, Janie Peterson in particular, his sister, incredibly eloquent, very convincing, and convinced that Scott Peterson didn't do it, meaning she's not arguing technicality. She's not arguing, the jury was unfair. His sister and family are convinced that Scott Peterson was wrongly convicted. The problem is that the evidence points otherwise.
Agree with
Lara, let me ask you. I mean, Dan really hit upon a number of points that people who believe that Scott Peterson is the one who actually murdered his wife, that it seems that he can't escape, and particularly the fishing and where the bodies were ultimately found. I mean, what is your response to that? If he does get a new trial, how could things really be different?
Bottom line, what a jury is going to look for is reasonable doubt. Just because I understand what Dan is saying, but just because the body was found there, and again, I haven't changed my mind. That could have been planted by someone else. I mean, for months, everybody was talking about Scott Peterson, exactly where he'd been fishing. That was never a secret. He didn't hide it from anyone. And it was something that
just so I understand, because I've heard this argument before. The idea is that they kidnapped her, heard all the media attention, and then they said, okay, we have to get rid of the body. So they waited till it jumped and became a big publicized case. So they weren't initially going to kill her?
Wait a minute. There was evidence that there was a burglary across their house on the same day as the disappearance of Laci Peterson. But clearly that we didn't get anywhere with that. There were even a couple of individuals, one who was an inmate in a prison who was speaking to his brother, and they were talking about how the man who was arrested for that burglary had in fact told one of them that Laci had seen them and had confronted them. So that was one of the theories that we had. And unfortunately, that tape later disappeared, so we never got our hands on it. What a coincidence we had there, too. And there was a neighbor who also testified that there was a burglary across the Peterson house on the same day that Laci, on the 24th, the morning of the 24th, right around the time that she may have been kidnapped. We don't know exactly what time she was kidnapped. I mean, everybody is trying to come up with a theory. All we know is this lady disappeared. And the one thing I know that a jury has to find is reasonable doubt. Just because a body showed up where the husband had been fishing And months later, for months, by the way, they'd been looking everywhere. They'd covered every inch of that, the water. And they never found.
I want to talk about that. And we're going to get into that physical evidence and how you might be able to dispose of the bodies and why they turned up in April. There's a lot to get to because I still want to get into the appeal and what these arguments are and what we can expect at 5:30. Dan, I know we have to sign you off. Thanks for your perspective. Appreciate it as always. And again, I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about Scott Peterson. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, a lot more.